From the Sigmund Freud, The Interpretation of Dreams, a masterpiece from 1900. Last chapter. The unconscious and consciousness, reality. It will be seen on closer consideration that what the psychological discussion in the preceding sections invites to is not the existence of two systems near the motor end of the apparatus, but the existence of two kinds of processes of excitation or modes of its discharge. It is all one to us, for we must always be prepared to drop our conceptual scaffolding if we feel that we are in a position to replace it by something that approximates more closely to the unknown reality. So let us try to correct some conceptions which might be misleading so long as we looked upon the two systems in the most literal and crudest sense as two localities in the mental apparatus. Conceptions which have left their traces in the expressions to repress and to force a way through. Thus, we may speak of an unconscious thought seeking to convey itself into the preconscious so as to be able then to force its way through into consciousness. What we have in mind here is not the forming of a second thought situated in a new place, like a transcription which continues to exist alongside the original. And the notion of forcing a way through into consciousness must be kept carefully free from any idea of a change of locality. Again, we may speak of a preconscious thought being repressed or driven out and then taken over by the unconscious. These images, derived from a set of ideas relating to a struggle for a piece of ground, may tempt us to suppose that it is literally true that a mental grouping in one locality has been brought to an end and replaced by a fresh one in another locality. Let us replace these metaphors by something that seems to correspond better to the real state of affairs. And let us say instead that some particular mental grouping has had a cathexis of energy attached to it or withdrawn from it, so that the structure in question has come under the sway of a particular agency or been withdrawn from it. What we are doing here is once again to replace a topographical way of representing things by a dynamic one. What we regard as mobile is not the psychical structure itself, but its innervation. Nevertheless, I consider it expedient and justifiable to continue to make use of the figurative image of the two systems. We can avoid any possible abuse of this method of representation by recollecting that ideas, thoughts, and psychical structures in general must never be regarded as localized in organic elements of the nervous system, but rather, as one might say, between them, where resistances and facilitations provide the corresponding correlates. Everything that we can be an object of our internal perception is virtual, like the image produced in a telescope by the passage of light rays. But we are justified in assuming the existence of the systems which are not in any way psychical entities themselves and can never be accessible to our psychical perception like the lenses of the telescope, which cast the image. Not the telescope is the real world, the whole world, but the image that it projects. And if we pursue this analogy, we may compare the censorship between two systems to the refraction which takes place when a ray of light passes into a new medium. So far, we have been psychologizing on our own account. It is time now to consider the theoretical views which govern present day psychology and to examine their relation to our hypotheses. The problem of the unconscious in psychology is, in the forcible words of Lips, 1897, less a psychological problem than the problem of psychology. So long as psychology, the reductive psychology, dealt with this problem by a verbal explanation to the effect that psychical meant conscious, and that to speak of unconscious psychical processes was palpable nonsense. Any psychological evaluation of the observations made by physicians upon abnormal mental states was out of the question. The physician and the philosopher can only come together if they both recognize that the term unconscious psychical processes is the appropriate and justified expression of a of solidly established fact. The physician can only shrug his shoulders when he is assured that consciousness is an indispensable characteristic of what is psychical. And perhaps if he still feels enough respect for the utterances of philosophers, he may presume that they have not been dealing with the same thing or working at the same science. For even a single understanding observation of a neurotic's mental life or a single analysis of a dream must leave him with an unshakable conviction that the most complicated and most rational thought processes, which can surely not be denied the name of psychical processes, can occur without exciting the subject's consciousness. It is true that the physician cannot learn of these unconscious processes until they have produced some effect upon consciousness which can be communicated or observed. But this conscious effect may exhibit a psychical character quite different from that of the unconscious process, so that internal perception cannot possibly regard the one as a substitute for the other. The physician, that's the materialist or the so called corona experts, the physician, Dr. Fauci, must feel at liberty to proceed by inference from the conscious effect to the unconscious psychical process. He thus learns that the conscious effect is only a remote psychical result of the unconscious process, and that the latter has not become conscious as such, not yet. And moreover, that the latter was present and operative even without betraying its existence in any way to consciousness. It was hidden or repressed. It is essential to abandon the overvaluation of the property of being conscious before it becomes possible to form any correct view of the origin of what is mental. In Lip's words, The unconscious must be assumed to be the general basis of psychical life. The unconscious is the larger sphere, like the iceberg. Below the water is much larger, the larger sphere, which includes within it the smaller sphere of the conscious at the tip. It's just a little tip, the conscious. Everything conscious has an unconscious preliminary stage, whereas what is unconscious may remain at that stage and nevertheless claim to be regarded as having the full value of a psychical process. The unconscious is the true psychical reality. In its innermost nature, it is as much unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and it is as incompletely represented or presented by the data of consciousness as is the external world by the communications of our sense organs. So, as we, with our very reductive sense organs, especially the five senses, cannot see the whole world, so the conscious us, the conscious ego, can only see a fracture of the whole reality that is unconscious, that is mysterious, that is so powerful that it will always win. So bye bye, Dr. Fauci.